Hey, I guess we have it's time to start. Good day to you all and a very warm welcome to today's virtual event hosted by the Excellence Cluster Africa Multiple of the University of Bayreuth and Bayreuth and the Center for Humanitarian Action on the topic on the basis of need alone, data gathering, impartiality, and the localization of humanitarian action. Our discussion will focus on the tension of prioritizing needs in times of scarce resources, as well as key challenges and dilemmas surrounding the assessment where needs are greatest. My name is Sonja Höfelmann, and I work as a research fellow with the Center for Humanitarian Action, a Berlin-based think tank working on humanitarian issues. I'm very excited to share this virtual discussion with my four fellow panelists. Joël Glasmont from the University of Bayreuth, Claudia Apo from the World Food Programme, Diego Otegui from the University of Delaware, and Corinna Kreidler from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, formerly known as DFID in Zimbabwe. Before we dive into the topic and the discussion, a few comments on housekeeping. I kindly ask all participants to keep their video off and their audio muted, as this session is recorded and it eases a bit with our recording. To have an interactive session as much as possible, given this virtual event, please post questions and comments into the public chat, or if you do prefer to do this in a private way, send a private message to Cha Darina, who will monitor the chat during the discussion. If you experience technical issues, please direct your question to the user Cha Technical Support in a private message, and my colleague Arvid will do his utmost to help you with technical issues. Today's event is part of a series called Humanitarian Reflections, Research Meets Practice, which aims to enable a conversation between researchers and practitioners who work on similar topics. I think both sides wish to take account the other side, that research is also relevant for practice and that findings are read, heard, or even taken up. And I think similarly, practice is eager to learn from research, also under pressure to use scientific evidence. However, bridging that gap is not always easy, and we at the CHA, we're experimenting in ways to enable a fruitful dialogue between both spheres. In February this year, we had our last event in this series, and our learnings from that event were that research and practice follow very different time horizons, that concepts and terms do not necessarily mean the same thing for everyone, and that the constraints of the profession pose very different realities for practitioners and researchers. But there's also unity, for example, data. Both realms concern themselves with similar questions. How do we collect data? What is the quality of the data that we have? And what methods and concepts do we use to analyze them? So we hope with this series to make internal discussions transparent, how decisions are made, and what are some of the dilemmas and difficult choices that the sector has to deal with. It is not about finding solutions to very technical assessments or judging or evaluating practices, but it's today a room for finding a shared language and to share reflections from each side. Today, we have the honor to hear from 4 experts, 2 researchers and 2 practitioners, to hear their reflection on how humanitarians quantify and prioritize needs. The way we define needs and the way we prioritize them has real-world implications for millions of people. With the global COVID pandemic, this question is already very pressing. It's been calculated that the number of food insecure people will likely double due to COVID, while humanitarian funding might not likely raise in the same level. Without a universal definition of need, it is hard to know what or who to prioritize consistently to ensure that people have equal access to assistance. But universal hierarchies of needs are often critiqued for being externally imposed and not culturally relevant. Although today's debate is certainly not a new one, the shift to take local context more into account is providing the opportunity to reflect on this issue in a new light. Is the model of a universal hierarchy of needs still appropriate in times of a shift to locally led humanitarian action? Doesn't accountability to affected populations also force us to rethink how prioritization of needs should pay more attention to cultural and socio-economic factors? And how can we shield humanitarian action from politicization of state donors if there is no common denominator that determines consistently where needs are greatest? To make this point a bit more illustrative, I will end with one example, my introduction. Research has demonstrated that it was normal to accept higher levels of acute malnutrition in South Sudan than elsewhere, also creating a higher threshold for a response than elsewhere. This being said, it of course begs the question on who is leading on prioritization. Is it the local actors on the ground that say that people are acutely hungry and that a response is needed? And what if the IPC, so the International Classification to Determine Hunger, says otherwise? With this dilemma, and before we have the chance to hear from the panelists who share their views on this issue, I invite all participants to contribute in the following poll. What do you think? How should humanitarian needs be prioritized? Should we use a consistent and universal approach? Or should we rather use a flexible approach according to cultural and social conditions? Waiting for a few more. If you feel like you can't decide on either one, that's okay. You can also not participate in the poll, but please, I'd be happy if you could provide some examples or dilemmas in the chat that you as practitioners have come across in your daily work regarding this dilemma. I will now close the poll and show the results, and everyone should see the results. And we have a very obvious majority saying that we should be using a flexible approach according to cultural and social conditions, 81%. Very interesting. I will now close the poll. I hope it's all disappeared for everyone. With that in mind, Diego, I'd like to start with you. Diego Etegi is a PhD researcher with the University of Delaware in disaster science and management. He's also a senior advisor to the head of disaster and crisis unit with the IFRC in the Americas regional office. His research focuses on decision-making in disaster response, where he applies people-centered and participatory methods to understand individual motivations of aid actors. Diego, in times of locally led humanitarian action and more focus on accountability to affected population, are universal hierarchies of needs, of human needs, still appropriate? Over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Sonia. Good morning to me. Good morning to everybody. Good afternoon for those that are far away from me. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and allow me to start by saying that I'm not a traditional researcher, scholar. I spent many years in my younger years in the field. So what I've accomplished in my academic life is very much influenced and driven by things that I saw when I was purely a practitioner. The topic that we have in front of you is super complex, and it would take ages, and I've been doing research about this particular topic for many years, and I thought that the most appropriate response for this particular question and my contribution to the panel is maybe by starting that I think that question, that very first question, is a little bit tricky. And I will probably kind of frame the response a little bit better in the second part of the panel, but we are tending to present these two as the two alternatives, you know, like two extremes in a kind of a linear sequence of alternatives. And I don't think that that is the case, and it's confusing. For this particular first stage in this panel, I wanted to focus on the following idea, which is on the idea of need. And then when you get back to me in the second part, then I would like to focus on standardization and flexibility and what is that, why I'm saying what I'm saying. But I would start like right away by saying that I don't think that there is a universal hierarchy of anything. The sole idea of saying that there is something universal, it removes the colorful, you know, and wonderful diversity of our world. So nothing is universal, nothing is global. And specifically needs. Actually, if you think about it, the sole idea of need is extremely subjective. You can put two individuals, you know, one besides the other, or two families, or two groups, or two communities, or two countries, and you will never have the same response. But even if you do, I think that the problem is not itself in finding or defining the need, but is in the satisfaction of that need. In my experience and in my research, those are two distinct and very problematic areas. The first one is, how do we, even if we agree or even if we don't agree that needs are not universal, how do we collect that data to determine what are those needs? And between parentheses, let me share with the audience that I'm usually concerned with the way that individuals understand these conversations. So I'm concerned about, you know, the cognitive and symbolic way and the meaning that we assign to things. And from that point of view, if we are talking about data, for instance, and even like we can discuss, but if I agree with somebody else that needs are universal, we'll still have the dilemma of how exactly we collect the data, how we process that data, and what we do with that data. But on the other side, we have the problem of the satisfaction, right? I strongly emphasize that needs, again, are not universal. So there is no way in the world that you can approach humanitarian action saying, you know, everybody needs, even if in those extreme circumstances, like if you talk about medicine or water, research is strongly showing that it's not the case. You have people that usually choose to express that what they want is something different to what we assume that they want. But then the satisfaction of that need is a whole different story. So just to finalize this kind of the first part of my response, I think it's interesting to mention something about like the evolution of this idea of need, which, you know, I think, Joel, you are a historian, and maybe you have more information and you are more knowledgeable about this, but the idea of like where we are standing today evolved from, you know, its origins nearly 150 years ago, you know, when humanitarian action was mostly or entirely driven by a desire to like support victims in armed conflict. So, and now humanitarian action is so much broader, and we are, you know, taking on so many different issues, global issues, that is so different to the world that we had 150 years ago. And we are trying to apply the same kind of rules to every single circumstance. And, you know, armed conflict is not the same as, you know, a drought, or, you know, anything that happens after a disaster, like a post-disaster context. So when you consider our new world, it is more, it is easier to emphasize that the idea of need and trying to respond to this question, do we use one approach or the other? It doesn't apply. It is a problem with the system itself and the business model that the system and the organizations within the system uses. And I will refer to this in the second part of the panel. Okay. Back to you.
Thank you, Diego, for your input. The ball has already been passed to you, Joël, regarding the evolution. Joël Glasmont is the historian and professor at the University of Bayreuth. He has worked and published extensively on the history of humanitarian assistance in Africa. And his latest book tackles the history of the concept of needs and its quantification. It's called Minimal Humanity, Humanitarianism, and the Quantification of Human Needs. Joël, very glad to have you with us today to share some insights of your research and provide some findings that you've come across when you analyzed how humanitarians quantify needs. One of the findings of the book is that an emphasis is put on needs that are easy to quantify. But humanitarian needs often result out of complex historical or political factors that might not be so easy to quantify. What critical aspects do you see when taking a universal approach to human needs? And shouldn't we place those needs more into context? And I think your book provides very interesting examples. Could you tell us a little bit more? Over to you, Joël.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm very glad to take part in this conversation and humbled by the level of expertise gathered in this virtual room. As you said, I'm a historian, and I'm interested in the history of the quantification of needs in the last 5 and 10 years, but also in the last 50 years and 100 years maybe. And one of the central questions of my work or problem that I'm trying to understand is how comes that we trust numbers so well when we talk about needs, and that we have, when we look at needs from a global point of view, we have a very neat, coherent, seemingly objective presentations of needs on the global scale. When we look at reports or humanitarian needs overviews produced by OCHA, for instance. And on the other hand, if we talk to humanitarian experts in the field producing need assessment, producing the numbers that we are using at the end, they are very open about their lack of knowledge, about the problem that they have producing figures, producing statistics about needs, doing need assessments, whether you talk with epidemiologists or nutritionists or country directors of NGOs trying to feed the matrix with numbers regarding needs. They're quite open about the fact that there are many things that they do not know, that they are cautious, very cautious about the figures that they use and give. There are many extrapolations in the figures, improvisation, the use of proxies, many countries, many regions where it's very difficult to access, very difficult to produce quantitative studies. So on the one hand, in the field, there is no illusion about the quality of the data that humanitarian organizations produce. But on the other hand, from the point of view of global reports, need assessments become synonymous with, aggregated data, quantitative overviews. It's all about numbers, and the idea that these numbers are precise and therefore objective, transparent, efficient. And and humanitarian data very often is used quite uncritically. So that's the core of the question. How comes that there is a gap between, on one side, a grand narrative about quantifying needs, knowing the needs of the people, comparing the needs of the people over time and over space, and then on the other side, you know, on the everyday production of figures in the field, an awareness for the lack of knowledge that we have. How comes that there is this gap? And I think we can go on for this. We hear a lot this grand narrative about evidence-based decision-making, data revolution, and all this very fancy narrative about how powerful these numbers are about assessing the needs. But really, we tend to forget the low quality of knowledge behind the numbers. And that's maybe, for me, the single most important point that I would like to raise today.
Okay, thank you, Joël. Now the floor is over to the two practitioners that are joining us. One of them is Claudia Apo, who works for the WFP, the World Food Programme, and is head of needs assessment and targeting unit there. And she's leading a team of 10, for example, in targeting and prioritization processes. Claudia brings more than 50 years of experience in assessing needs and vulnerabilities to the table. She has a long-term practical experience, for example, in Liberia and in many countries of the Middle East, as well as recently with the Rohingya refugee response. At WFP, work with VAM, which stands for Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping, is said to be the brain of WFP. Needs assessment, indices, and prioritization are your day-to-day business. What are tools and instruments that you use to prioritize needs? And does WFP take a consistent and universal approach to prioritize those needs across countries, across regions? And yeah, with that, over to you, Claudia.
Yes, thank you very much, Sonia. There's actually a few slides. Are you going to move them? Okay, maybe the next one then. And we can go straight to the next. Perfect. Thank you very much. So, no, one before, please. That was too fast. Thank you. Okay, now I just wanted to say a few words about the UN World Food Programme, as just for everybody to understand a bit where I'm coming from, where I'm working. So the World Food Programme actually has a dual mandate. So we are working both in humanitarian and development settings. Last year in 2019, we supported close to 100 million people, either through food and cash transfers, but also through asset creation and capacity strengthening programs. I wanted to also mention that we have a strong footprint in the field, with 90% of our staff actually employed in the field where the action is happening. Now you can move to the next slide, please. Yes, so why is actually needs assessment that my team is responsible for to support at global level? Why is that actually relevant? And I just wanted to start with a few numbers here. So we already heard that the number of food insecure people is actually on the rise. Sonia mentioned that at the beginning in her introduction. So in 2019, 619 people were actually suffering from chronic hunger, and 135 million were in food crisis. At the same, and these numbers have been consistently increasing over the last years. At the same time, as the entire humanitarian world, also WFP is facing funding shortfalls. So if, for example, in 2019, that was 34%. So what is the consequence of that? We as WFP, but as broader than that, as the humanitarian community as a whole, has the responsibility to ensure that those that are greatest in need are being protected and prioritized and are not left behind. If you go to the next slide, please. So now maybe just to add on one point is that why we need to have some comparability is in this humanitarian context is because a life in one place such as Sudan should count the same as a life in Yemen and a life in Haiti. So for these purposes, I would say we need comparability and some standards that we can reference to. Okay, here just to show you that the gap between the needs and available funding has actually continuously been rising since 2010-12. So it now stands actually at, or last year it stands at 37%. That's the UN funding vis-a-vis the humanitarian appeals. These are numbers that actually are regularly monitored by OCHA. If you go to the next slide. Just wanted to show you a little bit like what are the different tools that are typically being applied by us, but also by many others. So the first one is that we always do in most cases is actually focus group discussions. And why is that? Is because we really want to see what's happening on the ground and how people are affected and from their perspective. But then in order to do some quantification, we also often do some surveys or assessments using more quantitative tools. Where we have humanitarian access constraints, we also have other options to stay in contact with the affected populations through live calls, but also more recently through web surveys. Finally, there are other tools like remote sensing and big data, which also increasingly play a role. Next slide, please. So these assessments are not done in isolation. So what's very important is that the data is being analyzed using a multi-partner approach. And I wanted to give you one example, which is referred to as the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. That was also mentioned by Sonia at the beginning. So just to give you a quick introduction to it, it's a multi-partner initiative. There's roughly 15 actors being involved. And the idea is to provide rigorous evidence and consensus-based analysis. And the agencies that are, or the institutions that are being involved include government, UN agencies, NGOs, as well as representatives of civil society at global, regional, country, and local level. So it's not a process that is happening somewhere on somebody's desktop, but there is a lot of interaction happening. Next slide, please. So how does it then work in practice? So people at these various levels are coming together, and there's also certain quality controls mechanisms in place. We don't have time now to go into all that detail, but certainly the issue that was raised by Joel earlier is certainly acknowledged, and there are safeguards in place to try to get as best data out of the process as possible. So, but in principle, people are coming together. Everybody prepares data, and everybody has the right to bring that, or every agency that is involved can bring data to the table. And then there are discussions around for certain areas within a, let's say in a country, if there could be this could happen at the subnational level, at a district level, for example, where these experts come together, and based on the data and using a reference table, they can, and also based on their local knowledge, they decide the proportion of the population that are falling into these 5 phases that you see here. So the first one is food secure or minimal food insecurity. Second is stressed. Third is crisis. Fourth is emergency. And fifth is catastrophe or famine. That's obviously the phase that has to be avoided and prevented to happen at all costs. So there's a reference table with indicators that can help to guide this. Obviously, the local knowledge that people have from the ground also very much helps to put those numbers into perspective. So maybe just concluding on that, based on this analysis, for example, we know on very recent fresh data, we know, for example, that 5.7 million people in DRC are falling into phase 4 and above, 4.9 in Yemen, 3.5 in Afghanistan. This is just to give you an example. Now, once we know how many people are being affected, we then use a combination of tools to design the actual response. To design targeting strategies, to design, to decide on transfer modalities, etc. And that's very much based on contextual analysis and again, community-based consultations. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that I don't see a big contrast between universal standards and context-specific analysis. I think they both need to exist and they need to work hand in hand. So I'm done now, and I would like to hand back to Sonia, back to Sonia, and then also look forward to hear from Corina from her perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. With that, Corina was already introduced as our next speaker and final speaker for this round. Corina is a humanitarian advisor for food security and cash and voucher assistance with the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in Zimbabwe. She has 20 years of experience in humanitarian policy and practice, among them as a team leader for the Cyclone Response in Mozambique in 2018, with NRC and ECHO in Liberia, Sudan and DRC, as well as long-term experience with working for NGOs also in Liberia, Angola and Burundi. Corina, you have worked for quite different humanitarian actors, among them donors, NGOs, but also large international agencies. But today, from a donor perspective, I guess it makes sense to wish for a universal and consistent approach to ensure comparability of needs across countries. But as a technical advisor, you're also very close to the ground. Is a universal approach the best way to ensure impartiality?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this highly distinguished panel. As you mentioned, so I will talk from a donor perspective, and my first point is that needs assessments are never an end in themselves. They are always there to help us, all people taking decisions at different levels, to take those decisions in the best and most informed way. And as somebody has put in the chat, the key objective of harmonizing and standardizing the quantification of needs is actually that all people are born with the same rights. So we need to ensure that suffering, wherever and by whomever in this world, receives the same level of attention and is acted upon in the same way. So from a donor perspective, using these globally agreed measuring sticks, such as the IPC that Claudia just introduced, is a firewall against political decision-making on the use of global funds by donor governments, but also on the number of people in needs established by host governments. We shouldn't forget that conflicts are the key driver of need in many of these days humanitarian crises. And these are political processes, and therefore data gathering in these contexts of political conflict are also obviously influenced by this context. They are not taking place in a void, of course. But these globally agreed measuring sticks are also a bulwark against personal and subjective decision-making by staff working in aid agencies. It shouldn't be up to a person to decide whether 1,000 people in a village should share one well or 250 people should share a well. And I think personally we've gone a long way there to eliminate this subjective factor. When I first came in contact with humanitarian aid, that was in Angola in 1998. And there we were actually totally left to our gut feeling, sort of how much aid should we provide in a camp of displaced people? How many blankets should a family have? How big should the tents be? It was really a very subjective decision-making process. And I think it's a great achievement that we have overcome that. So, as I said, budgets are global, and therefore the data underpinning the decisions on the use of that global money should also, to a certain level, be global. At least they have to be comparable at the global level, and in the area of food security and nutrition, the IPC has really brought a key change and a key improvement there. And also personally, I think it's important because these global data also allow us as citizens of our own countries, if we are citizens of donor countries, or if we are civil society organizations in donor countries, to hold our own governments to account. So as a German citizen, I have probably an opinion on how my government spends taxpayers' money in humanitarian aid. So has the Center for Humanitarian Action or FENRO or our NGOs. And having these global reference data actually helps us to underpin and make an argument if we don't agree with how our governments use our money. However, the use of these global data actually varies quite a bit across donor countries and donor institutions. Some use it as one source of information in addition to many others, and especially those donor countries who have a lot of their own staff on the ground tend to depend less on the numbers. And here I already want to disagree with Joelle. I don't think anybody who's based in the field believes that these numbers are scientific and what did you say? And that they are truly objective. We all know how loaded with questions they are. But I think the good news is they are loaded with questions across the globe and in each country. So that puts them kind of on an equal footing again. There are, however, also donor countries who do really make the humanitarian needs overviews or the humanitarian response plans a very key step in their own allocation processes, especially the Nordic countries do that. And then we should also not forget that a lot of the money these days is allocated through country-based pool funds or the CERF, the Central Emergency Response Fund. And these funds do have a very localized decision-making process, the country-based pool funds at least. So for the country level, the process of putting together this data and putting together those response plans, in my opinion, is just as important as the actual product, because it allows different actors with different insights, different interests, also different capacities to come together and have a discussion. It's definitely not a level playing field. I totally agree. It definitely needs to be more transparent, give local actors and affected people a much louder voice, no doubt about that. But, and here I would like to borrow a quote from Churchill on democracy, it's the worst needs assessment methodology except from all others, basically. Because we don't have anything that's better. So therefore, I think it's worth investing in it. And I think it's also important to mention that it's a learning system. The IPC, for example, has been externally evaluated last year. And I've just been listening into a talk from experts from the Feinstein Center at the Tufts University who are looking into the politics around numbers of people in needs in famine risk countries, both politics of overestimating those numbers, but also politics to underestimate. And before I conclude, I would like to briefly touch upon the standards. I think it's very important to mention and to remind ourselves that these are minimum standards, not absolute standards. And of course, they are locally adapted. When the Syria crisis broke out, the first thing the WASH clusters in the neighboring countries was to adopt the 15 liters per person per day that are generally used for remote African villages, for example. Or the minimum expenditure basket that we use to establish the cash transfer values are of course based on local purchasing power, on local habits, on local diets, etc. And these standards were a result of a highly participatory process when SPHERE was first developed. And I think that participation is also one reason for its global success. I think it's also important that we have these standards because they allow us to criticize each other, because we can denounce a variation from an agreed reference framework. If I'm approaching a fellow agency and I'm telling that what they are doing is not good enough, they cannot just say, how dare you criticize us, even though we have the best intentions in the world. No, I can refer to agreed standards and tell them the number of water, or the liters of water you're providing is not yet good enough because it's not meeting those standards. And also more positively, we can compete each other. For example, if a neighboring nutrition program manages to reduce the death rates considerably, and sphere standards help us to monitor that, I can learn from them and I can sort of see, oh, they are obviously doing better than what I do in my program. So how come and what can I learn? How do I have to adjust? And also that system, that global standards sphere system, is a learning system. And they have never pretended to set any wisdom in stone. So I think there is a lot of openness, both to learn from the advantages that these globally agreed measuring sticks help us, but also to work on the disadvantages. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists. I think this has been a very a timely panel so far. Everyone has stuck to their 5 minutes. With that, before we go into the second round, I would go over to my colleague Darina, who's been monitoring the chat for me because, yeah, as you probably all know, facilitating is always difficult, managing everything. Darina, have there been any interesting examples or also dilemmas with regard to the topic shared in the chat that you would like to pose to our panel?
Yes, thank you, Sonia. The chat is already active and there's already some discussion going on whether needs can be universal or not. And there's basically two views, one saying that, of course, standards like the sphere standards are based on universal human rights. So there was the opinion that human rights are universal and therefore globally acceptable. And but that the needs based on these sphere standards, universal human rights, are of course to be contextualized. And then there was the other opinion that although there are some individual needs, there is still some universal needs that we can discuss and that we should agree on. And there was already the question posed to the panel by one of the participants on which key principles or key needs we can base or consider programs. So basic key principles outside also the humanitarian world on which we can base our needs assessments. So that was what was going on in the chat so far, and there's still more, but I will leave that for a later discussion.
Thank you. Would anyone of the panel like to reflect on that question, or should we leave it for later to think about it a bit more? I mean, these are not very easy questions. Anyone raising a hand to answer on this? Okay, perhaps we'll leave it for later. I would like to come back on one issue that Claudia said, that comparability is important, that a South Sudanese person should count the same as Syrians. But apparently the previous lifestyle does determine the aid or level of aid you receive, because yeah, Syrian refugees receive, for example, other or more yeah, I don't want to say sophisticated, but other types of aid that, for example, Sudanese receive. Could cash be a tool to mitigate these differences? And could this be a way to enable a shift to local determination of priorities?
This is a question for me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. No, very good. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? I mean, we are not living in an ideal world, so it's it's the effect, and while we try to ensure that the needs of analysis that I described earlier is as objective and impartial as possible, and based on evidence, there are still a number of challenges that we are facing when it comes to translating these numbers into actual response. I mean, first of all, I think already Corinna pointed out that there are many other factors also being considered. It's needs being one of the dimensions that result in decision making. Let me mention a few challenges that we are facing as an agency sometimes. So when we are aware of which dilemmas we are facing. So one could be humanitarian access constraints. So maybe people are living in areas, the ones that are most in need, but they are not accessible. So that's a very serious constraint. There could be also logistical issues associated with cost efficiencies. How much does it cost to reach a smaller group of people in one area vis-a-vis a larger group of people in a slightly in another area? So these are certainly factors that also play a role. Then it comes down depending on, for example, if I mentioned asset creation programs, where we need to work with capable partners that support the implementation of those programs, and those capacities might also not be equally, or might not be based there where the needs are the most. Then very importantly, WFP is a voluntarily funded organization, and there is for quite a number of donors, there is earmarking happening for other reasons, for probably good reasons, but sometimes it's also giving us much less flexibility than to make those decisions. So earmarking could happen to certain countries, to certain populations within countries, to certain areas within countries, and also towards certain activities. So that's where our role is obviously to advocate based on the information that we have, to collect it, to jointly with our partners, and try to advocate for the most efficient and use of the resources, and then also to ensure that those that need it most are being considered. Another factor is also partially already touched upon, the fact that we work obviously with national partners on the ground, and national priorities might not be always in line with the needs that are being assessed through those tools that I mentioned earlier, and there might be other priorities based on other criteria. So that's another factor. And then yeah, so there's certainly, there can be politicization, and I think that's quite a known fact. It's a balance act, and yeah, we have to really try to make the best and to advocate for the right thing to happen.
Thank you.
Oh, and I forgot you had a second part of the question as well related to cash.
Exactly.
So now, let's leave the initial assessment on how many I need behind, but when we then talk about what should be done. So we actually, as an organization, we have been switching increasingly where feasible, I have to say, because it depends also on market functioning and many other factors. But there has been quite a switch from food to cash assistance over the past years. And I mentioned earlier, we are supporting around close to 100 million, and close to 30 million actually out of these are receiving cash instead of food transfers. And that obviously gives these households a lot of opportunities to decide actually how this cash is actually used in order to meet their most pressing needs at that point in time. if this cash is targeted to the most vulnerable areas and the most needy households, then we do have evidence that this cash is very often used for food. So, and yeah, so that's something that we increasingly do, and I think it's an important development that has happened over the last 5 to 10 years. Okay, back to you.
Thank you, Claudia. I also have a follow-up question to Corinna. If we look at, if we prioritize large-scale assessments that are, for example, done by WFP when assessing if cash is feasible, how do we effectively counter the bias of organizational mandate? I mean, the sector is very driven by mandates, and organizations will probably prioritize the sectors that they are working in. Does it matter who does the assessments? How open are they for different needs? And how flexible are they to be adapted to local context? You touched upon this in your first round, but perhaps you have another example regarding this flexibility.
Yeah, very happy to give examples from the last 3 key responses where I was based. So, for example, Mozambique, I was there to respond to the drought in 2016-17, and the entire needs assessment process was led and conducted by the State Secretariat for Food Security and Nutrition. So there was no doubt at all that they were in the driving seat. They needed, of course, logistical support, but in terms of methodology and technical capacity, it was very clear that they were the key actor. This contrasted a lot with the cyclone response last year, where the government was quite sidelined, I have to say, because they were first totally overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, but also there was a major language barrier with the international community working in English and the National Disaster Management Agency obviously working in Portuguese. And yeah, there weren't that many international Portuguese speakers, I can proudly say as myself, who sort of were able to bridge the gap. So that was a big issue there. Zimbabwe, again, the Food and Nutrition Council is actually the data collecting agency. It's not WFP doing the assessment, it's the Food and Nutrition Council. And without disclosing too much, I can assure you there is a very lively debate at the moment in a highly politicized society about how this should be done, how the results should be interpreted, and what the recommendations should be. And it's very important to emphasize that this, as Claudia said, is one source of information that needs to be triangulated by other sources. And then just a third example, where I've also worked in the DR Congo. The government there is a key actor in the conflict, and it's just not credible to ask the government to assess the spread of gender-based violence when you know that the army is amongst the key perpetrators of sexual violence. So we have to take this localization question with a pinch of salt. But we should also not forget that assessments aren't the only source. The importance of routine data is often underestimated, and that comes from local social services. For example, the admission rates of malnourished children into health facilities are a key source of data, and that is routine that comes from the most remote health facility, where the international community plays a role is helping logistically to collect the data. I think what localization really matters is when we get down to the very local level, and then we have to ensure that men and women, girls and boys of all ages, that their needs are properly observed, listened to, that they have a voice, that the old lady who can barely walk, that we go the extra mile to her home to listen to her concerns, the people with disabilities who are hidden somewhere by the families. So that's the point where I think the localization question is actually really mattering. And then most importantly, as I said, it's not an end in itself, the whole assessment process. It's to adjust and do the proper response planning based on those needs. On your other question on the mandate-driven issues, I think, well, what is key is sort of, for example, if you send me to the field, my comfort zone, my area of expertise is food security and nutrition. Of course, I will come back and tell you what the food security status of the population is. I will most likely not be able to tell you whether there will be a measles outbreak very soon, because I'm not sufficiently conversed in public health issues, immunization rates, etc. So there, what is really important is that we have different people with different skills and different experiences contributing. That's why one of the key objectives in global processes such as the Grand Bargain is to move to multi-sectorial assessments, so that we are sure that we are not sort of considering every problem being a nail just because the only tool we have is a hammer. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinna. So we've heard a lot about how practitioners view needs assessments and how to prioritize need. I would like to shift back to our two colleagues from the research side, Joelle and Diego. Joelle, maybe over to you. Do we need to turn back to assess needs within the context that they occur? And I would like to once again stress an example that you had in your book regarding the mid-upper circumference, where it was a standard where malnutrition was assessed very localized, very according to the culture, but then had developed into a rather global index. Can you tell us a little bit more about this example and your views? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I can pick this new example that you're quoting. This is the example. I mean, everybody knows this mid-upper arm circumference tool to measure malnutrition with young children under 5, right? This is a tool to measuring acute malnutrition. If the child is in the green zone, it's a healthy child. If it's a yellow zone, it's acutely malnourished, and if it's in red zone, it's about severe acute malnutrition. And if we look at the thresholds for this very instrument of need assessment, the thresholds in the last 50 years have been lowered, right? In the 70s, if you were a child under 5, you would need to have an arm circumference below 13 centimeter to be qualified as acute severe malnourished. And now it's 11.5 centimeter. So we see that the thresholds have changed over time and in a great manner. So and if we look at other thresholds, other standards, like the number of kilocalories that you will use to define what is enough, what is the minimum standards, right? Now it's set as 2,100 kilocalories per person and per day. That's an average minimum standard used by the Sphere project, for instance. But this standard in the past has been much higher. The International Labour Organization back in the 70s talked about 3,000 kilocalories per person and per day in average. So what I mean by that is just that, and I fully agree with Corinna Kreidler's point that it is a learning process, and of course it is. And in many aspects, the IPC is a much better tool that we ever had. And the IPC has been successful in raising attention on famine in the world, in different places, and to try to objectify what is a famine, and not to define famine only in political terms, but also in scientific terms, trying to qualify what is a famine exactly. But this, and I think this is the other part of the answer, is this is also per se a political project, right? There is a question here, why do we think that numbers are more objective, that it will help to eliminate the subjective factor? So somehow we still associate statistic with objectivity and non-statistical data, experience, professional knowledge, deliberation, ethnographic studies, and so on, and many more kind of evidence as subjective or more prone to subjectivity. And the reason why is still a question for me. It does not have always been like that. And I mean, for me, that's a case explained. Corinna Kreidler's example on an organization, we invest money in better numbers, and we invest in better tools, in computer, in digitalization, in big data. But sometimes we just forget to learn the language of the people we are working with. Portuguese or other languages and other skills to understand local communities are as important as investing large amount of money and efforts into more data. I will leave it like this for now, and maybe come back to this. Maybe Diego has something to say about that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joël. My last question to you, Diego, before we open the floor to all participants to raise the questions that we have in the chat. You mentioned in your introduction a critique of the business model, so the siloed approaches, the competition for funding, that these determine more which needs are prioritized. Can we come back to locally led prioritizing of aid as a way to put the business model of aid back on its feet, and to ensure that way that we act impartial and that we distribute relevant aid to our beneficiaries?
Thank you, Sonia, for that. Are we still on the Q&A section, or am I kicking off the second part of the panel?
We're on the second part of the panel.
Okay. So, well, thank you for that, and thank you, colleagues, for your amazing presentations. You made me change my entire presentation, like for the second part, but I'll give it a try, and I apologize if I'm a little bit confusing. But I think that my contribution for this second part is that, and allow me to clarify, starting by clarifying what I said before. And I totally agree with what Joel said and what Claudia said and what Corinna said. I think we are all aligned, interestingly, right? The reality is that, and this is not so much about research or practice, but I think everything points to that the closest that someone is to the people that suffers will be more inclined to try to adapt the response to whatever the person in front of us wants. And the further you are from those individuals, the more you will need, big data and aggregation. And that is just because how human brain works and how we are used to the systems in which we live in. So if you consider a country, then you have, the president and the ministries, and then, but what they do at that level is completely different to what the individuals need or want. And so we are used to a certain way of managing human life, and it's a political life. It's a political life because we surround communities with these fictitious political borders, and then you have certain levels of, in groups of people that are in charge of firstly, determining what kind of data do they need to make decisions for that people, and then the higher you go into that ladder, then you reach those other levels in which the only way that you can make decisions is with a different type of data, which is in essence much more quantitative and cold and objective. But both things are extremely necessary. I think that the confusion in the conversation that we have in front of us is to believe that this dichotomy between, a standard approach that we translate or we tend to believe that is the same as universality is we are thinking in terms of the people that we are trying to help and to serve, and that is not the case. I think that what you have is on one extreme of the humanitarian service, like more flexibility, the closer that you are to the people that you are trying to help, and standardized processes that are needed for other people that are far away from those individuals that we're trying to help. So if you consider that line, it's easy to realize that, and this is where the kind of the business model, and it's not the business in the corporate sense of the word, but in the political sense, that is essentially flawed. And I think that what is happening is that the humanitarian, again, system is realizing that we are not used to this system. We are used to having intermediaries. And the humanitarian response to whatever crisis you have is too direct. You don't have intermediaries. So what you have is somebody that is far away from whatever the problem is, being deployed or sending individuals, all the way to the other part of to the other extreme of the world to do things that they are not essentially qualified, not in the technical term, but in the cultural term, to assess anything. So I understand that this is a learning system and it's not perfect, and it probably will never be perfect. But I think that what I have concluded over the years is that as a learning system, that the learning part of the system is also flawed. And basically, and I'm kind of a vivid representation of what I'm saying, because you need others also to know and to learn how to produce knowledge, right? And the only way that that is working nowadays is that you have a whole bunch of, universities and research centers, usually, most generally in the global north and in the west. And because of the way that funding and strategic needs of of those funding mechanisms work, we are only producing individuals that are qualified to produce knowledge and collect data and analyze the data and use that data that belong actually to, not to the societies that we are trying to help, but to the societies where humanitarian services originate. So I don't know, I think that there are a few areas in the entire system, the political system, the academic system, that still need to be that need to be changed. So far, my feeling as someone from the global north is that we have some tools, and I understand that those tools were developed and they are not the most efficient and the better that and they could be better. But I think that what we are doing is pushing to continue using, making marginal changes to old tools instead of trying to come up with new tools. That is kind of the basic conclusion that I have. I don't know if that responds to your question. Sonia, back to you.
Thank you. So a call for perhaps decolonizing the tools and standards that we have. I have the feeling that our panel is quite on board with that needs assessments, and the standards that we have are indeed pose a universal approach to create some consistency across countries, but provide enough flexibility to be adapted to the local context. So all well with that regard, question mark. With that, I would invite all participants again to share questions and comments in the chat. And so far, it's been really a highly complex and rich discussion. With that, I would like to hand over to my colleague Darina. Darina, what's been going on in the chat?
Yes, thank you, Sonia. The chat has been very lively, and maybe I would like to start to feed in two very interesting comments and then also one question. So to start with the comments, there is one view that has been shared on how to define need, and one participant said that well, needs is based on what people know and on what they see also other people have and need around them. So the key words here is what the peer groups around them have. And the example was, if you ask a person what you need, and that person is a man, he might say he needs an axe because all of his other fellow friends also have one and he hasn't. If you ask his wife, she would say maybe she needs a new pot to cook in because her friends have fancy new ones. So it's all about who you ask and also what this person has and what other people around that person have. So that's just on the definition of need. Another comment has been shared about how we measure need. So it's about the way how organizations ask for needs and what they ask, because then they might create expectations that might also lead to loss of trust if that expectations are not fulfilled. Or if you ask people about what they need, you should be prepared to follow through, even if the set of needs, what the people told you is not part of your actual agenda. So that's just the two comments that I wanted to share. But then to the question. The question has been shared about proportionality of need and humanitarian assistance. So there was one example about Syrian refugees in the Middle East who receive per capita far more support than refugees in some African settings, for example, which is of course often criticized as inappropriate and politically driven. And in contrast, there is this culturally adjusted needs assessment approach, which might justify a different response in the two contexts. So we could of course discuss does a local needs approach justify a much higher level of support for such reasons, or do we need universal basic needs? No matter what background and prehistory that has been in that region. So with that, I'll hand back over to the panel and you, Sonia.
Thank you. Anyone would like to touch upon the issues or also the question that was posed to the panel? And I think you also have the option to read the question if something isn't quite clear. Corinna?
Yeah, I would like to take that question of the proportionality, because it's a question that has personally bothered me quite a lot. I still remember when I came first to Turkey and had focus group discussions, home visits with Syrian refugees. I had this sort of flash of, oh my God, if the Darfuri displaced people where I worked before, if they were living in these shelters, they would really be happy. And it was quite difficult sort of to deal with that, because obviously then sort of the Syrian refugee situation compared to my own, of course, was still, and compared to what the person was telling me about how life was back in Syria, was still very depressing. So as Claudia has also already said, we are not in an ideal world. So personally, I sort of settle on that question with that I have to accept that global aid budgets are also influenced by political agendas. The migration agenda is very dominant these days. There's historical reasons. If you look at Germany, and why the people why we are giving as much money to Congo as we are giving to Palestine, for example. The only reason for that is historical, I think. So what we do have to do then, if we accept that this is disproportional, is that within these countries, there we are very strictly needs-based, and we make whatever we can to ensure that then within that response, the relative most vulnerable in that context are the key focus of our attention. And there very often we actually meet a lot of resistance from local actors talking about culturally dominated standards, because in a lot of, especially in African societies, equal treatment is much more important than equitable treatment. So they think that everybody should get something, and we often come with the understanding that the most vulnerable, so a subgroup, they should receive the entire pot that is available. And that leads to a lot of issues. And for example, in Zimbabwe, we had actually WFP had the example where the village chief did a forced redistribution. So the 4 ladies who were lucky enough to be on the beneficiary list were called upon that they had to share their food assistance, and one lady refused, and she called the WFP hotline and complained. So there was an investigation, and yeah, it was very clear that from the village perspective, selecting beneficiaries based on vulnerability criteria was the wrong thing to do. The entire village should have been given a proportionate percentage of the available assistance, and that would have suited the cultural context from the village head's perspective much better than a targeting process. Over.
Thank you. Sure.
Yes, if I may, this issue of proportionality is very important, and I agree with Corinna Kreidler on this, that this is one central issue to tackle. It was raised by the chat, and the question is, where does it come from, proportionality? There's the idea that humanitarian aid and humanitarian aid should be given in proportion to the needs. That's the famous definition of impartiality, which is one of the core principles on the basis of need alone. Yet if you look at where it comes from, this idea of proportionality, it was invented by a jurist working for the International Committee of the Red Cross back in the early 1950s. And he coined the phrase on the basis of need alone, right? And why did he do that? First, because of course he had a moral interest, he had a philosophical and he has an interest as a lawyer to find new, better principles for humanitarian aid. But he had also his own interests. As a lawyer working for the ICRC, he was also trying to avoid the rising of power of the national leagues of the Red Cross within the Red Cross movement. The national leagues of the Red Cross were challenging the authority of the ICRC back after the Second World War. And Jean Pictet is quite open about the fact that he invented proportionality also because he wanted to make the point that the ICRC was better and more efficient and more impartial, better humanitarian than the national leagues of the Red Cross. And so looking at the past of those concepts, right, helped us to see that even those ideas that we have and that they are now leading in humanitarian aid, they come from somewhere. They are local constructs. They also entail some subjective ideas about why aid have to be impartial at all, actually. And this is, I think, something that we have to tackle, to look at closely when we use this concept. Where do they come from? Who invented them, and for what purposes? And we should not assume that these principles are universal per se. They also come from somewhere.
So a bit of a similar point than Diego's, problematizing what we understand as universal and yeah, opening for more diverse views on what we consider universal. Would anyone of the others like to comment, or should we give room to further questions? I don't see any raised hands from the panel, so perhaps Darina, any further questions from our engaged participants?
Yes, of course. What just came in was a very interesting humanitarian development peace nexus perspective. So someone was asking, doesn't the nexus, so the humanitarian development peace interrelationship and interaction thinking or approach mean that good humanitarian practice should mean understanding, at least at the minimum, how people perceive and sort of rate their needs in terms of development, livelihoods, and peace, etc. So what does it mean if these needs, for example, peace or development, are seen as more important or intermediate than humanitarian needs, for example? Yeah.
Diego?
Oh, go ahead, Corina. Well, I just wanted to ask if she can clarify the last part of the question that I didn't get it.
So yeah, maybe I'll try again. So we were thinking about the relationship or interaction between the different sectors or ways of thinking, the humanitarian lens, where we talk about immediate life-saving needs, the development lens, more livelihoods, recovery, and then also the peace lens, meaning absence of conflict and violence, at least. So if we want to think through these three different approaches, and maybe people, if we ask people, maybe they would rate the absence of violence as more important than their immediate humanitarian needs, meaning, for example, enough food, enough water supply, etc. If they see the absence of violence more important than the humanitarian needs, what would that mean for us as the humanitarians? I hope I could clarify a bit. I'm happy to elaborate more if you...
No, I just I think that we don't have much more time, but I think that something that is usually missing in my understanding in these conversations is, again, it's the need to clarify the context that we are trying to, apply the conversation. So it's not this, you can have a very large disaster, and that will not mean that you have life-saving needs, right? So I think that there is a tendency from the humanitarian sector in its entirety to conceive itself as, we are saving lives, and that is very rarely the case. And again, only in extreme circumstances, and even in those extreme circumstances, you have usually groups of people, that are really in need. But that is not, of course, the same in need of life-saving assistance. But that, of course, is not the same if you are talking about, an armed conflict in a country that literally doesn't have a government. So the way that we ought to understand the service that we provide changes from one circumstance to the other. It also changes if we are seeing ourselves in terms of, like short-term service deliver, or if we are part of that longer conversation about what is going to happen with the humanitarian system in the future. And that is where the humanitarian and development linkage comes into. And those are very complex conversations, but they need to be taken like separate, right? It's difficult to put all of them together because then we are trying to generalize and then the confusion in these conversations perpetuate. That's all I had to say.
Would anyone else like to reflect on the question regarding the openness of assessments and the interest that we also create by asking questions and how we can fulfill them? Corinna?
I would go back to the way I understood the nexus question, if that's all right. I mean, there is no doubt that peace would resolve a lot of the humanitarian issues that we have, but as Madame Ogata once said, there will never be a humanitarian solution to a political problem. So I think on that front, we would always be defeated by peace-building actors, political actors actually doing their job, and then we would sort of lose most of ours, which would be fine. On the division between the development and the humanitarian needs, I would want to be sure that we have asked the old lady or the mother of the very sick children what her needs are before we say that development needs are more important to the society. My experience is that it's often the better off people who are asking for livelihood support, for example. Income generating activities, etc., are high on everybody's agenda, but sort of you have to have reached a certain level, and that level is very contextually different, to ask for more, whilst those who are really in a dire situation, often those are the ones that ask for still humanitarian services. And before we are, and if we are not sure that we have asked these people, I would not want to move from an emergency focus to or humanitarian focus to a development focus. And just to reply to Diego, I agree that the life-saving discourse is very prominent, but don't forget we are saving life and reduce suffering. That's the second objective of humanitarian aid, and that's definitely what we also do in those situations where we are not immediately saving lives.
Thank you. We're approaching the end of our online or virtual event. I would invite all panelists for a final statement, and perhaps you can also reflect on an idea or a thought that you learned today from the other perspective. So what do you take home perspective from the other side, be it research or practice? Perhaps we'll start with Claudia. What do you think? Any final remarks, and what do you take home from the research side?
Oh, thank you very much. It was very inspiring to hear those different perspectives. So I would like to thank my panel colleagues. I think there was somebody in the chat who emphasized the importance of, she mentioned actually that the role of cash also, that it provides more dignity to the affected population. And I think that's an important point that I just wanted to highlight again, and the role of that, depending on what type of assistance provided, that it can empower the people that are affected. And then maybe some of those questions then are also more theoretical, but in the end of the day, we have to see what's really happening on the ground and hand the stick over. That's my point.
Thank you. Joelle, what do you take home from this discussion, and what is your final statement?
Yes, thank you. I think what strikes me most is, of course, this idea of learning process, and this hope for the fact that our tools are getting better, and that tools like IPC or other tools of need assessments and other tools to compare the situations are getting better and are going to help us to make better work. And the same time, of course, I think that we have to, if we want this to be a learning process and the tools to be better, we have to acknowledge the knowledge problem at the core, and to raise awareness for the limits of the evidence that we have, the limits of the statistic, of the numbers that we have, the limits of our own definitions of needs and standards, and maybe to have more attention for knowledge on local communities, on languages, and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Diego, over to you. Final last comments.
So I think I always appreciated, the side of practice, but I do believe that practice is super diverse. You have, government agencies, lots of money, very big, special or unique interests responding to governments, but then you have smaller, non-profits, some of them are very old and traditional, and some of them are even smaller, and they're just created momentarily when something happens. So we are seeing this large increase of the presence of smaller, non-very well, not very knowledgeable organizations, flying around the world and and participating in different places. When you see that picture, I think that it may be easier to and clearer the discussion around localization. Leaving aside for 1 second, those very important, conflicts, Syria, Rwanda in its moment, Darfur, and you do have a really large number of people that are suffering, and the origins of the suffering is a different context to the one that usually the humanitarian sector refers to. And there is still, in my opinion, a whole conversation around the distrust to local authorities that hasn't been necessarily approached to the level that it should, right? So I am participating and working for the IFRC, and I understand and I appreciate the unique structure that they have, so you have national societies and they have...
Diego, we're running a bit low on the time. Please keep your answer short.
Apologies. I would say that just, bring back into that conversation, why the need of all these organizations to go directly and, and be present in the field, as opposed to trusting a bit more the governance that exists already in those places.
Thank you. Corona, the floor to you for an observation, final remark.
Yeah, I'll be very good. So what I've taken away from the academic side is actually that idea of a historical perspective in the first place. We have had that a little bit when cash sort of became prominent. There were researchers going back into the history and looking when cash was first used, and that took us quite a number of years back. So now I'll have a look at what Joel has found out about how needs assessments, taking us back in time, how that looked. And then just sort of overall, I think the bottom line of all this discussion about standards and commensurability is accountability. So that each actor in the system is ready to be held accountable for what he or she does or what he or she does not do. And if we agree on that basic level, I think that would already bring us quite a step forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, I thank all panelists for their inputs, their time, and also your willingness to engage in this debate and this experiment of bridging the gap between research and practice. One further note, all participants and also, of course, panelists are kindly invited to our hybrid conference on the Triple Nexus in about 4 weeks. Find the information also on our website. And I want to thank the team behind the scenes because without their support, this would not have been possible. So thank you to all participants for making time, for staying, for sharing their comments and questions in the chat. With that, I'll end this virtual meeting. Thank you to everyone for participating, and have a good day. Goodbye.